Carl Jung believed that certain psychological truths are so volatile that they must find you at exactly the right moment. But once they do, the results must remain a secret. Not because the truth is shameful, because the world is not ready for what you have seen, and more importantly, the world is not ready for what you are about to become. There is a concept Jung called participation mystique. It is the shared unconscious cloud that most people live inside without ever knowing it. They are merged with the group, the family, the room. They feel what the collective feels. They agree to see what the collective agrees to see. But a small group of people, a group Jung called the conscious minority, have broken away from that cloud. They have differentiated. They absorb what others cannot face. They sense things no one else will name. They see patterns that haven't formed yet, lies that haven't been spoken yet, pain that hasn't been admitted yet. Jung did not celebrate this. He warned about it. Why did Jung instruct his most perceptive patients to stay silent about what they saw in others? And what happens to the person who finally realizes they are not simply watching a drama unfold around them, but that they are the only one fully awake in the room? That is the question this video is going to answer. And if this video has found you at this exact moment in your life, there is a reason for that. Let us begin where Jung himself began. Not in a lecture hall, not in a published paper, but in his private clinical notes during one of the most turbulent periods of his professional life. The year was 1913. Jung had just severed his relationship with Sigmund Freud, the most significant professional break of his career. He was navigating what he later described in his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, as a confrontation with the unconscious. His internal world was in upheaval, and it was during this period that he began treating a patient who would permanently change his understanding of what human perception can do to a person. Consider a composite profile that closely mirrors the cases Jung documented during this period. A young woman, deeply introverted, highly intelligent. She presented not with psychosis, not with delusion, but with something far more unusual. She could walk into any room and immediately, without explanation, know things. Not in a mystical sense, in a precise, unsettling, psychological sense. She knew who was lying before a single dishonest word had been spoken. She could feel the weight of suppressed grief in a person who appeared perfectly composed. She sensed the resentment simmering beneath a warm handshake. She could detect the thin wire of anxiety stretched across a confident voice. Jung wrote of cases like hers, noting the patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others. But this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She could not hold a job, not because she lacked capability, but because her presence made people uncomfortable without their knowing why. She could not maintain casual friendships because she saw through the social masks that hold casual friendships together. And those masks exist for a reason. When someone's mask is removed, even unconsciously, they do not thank the person responsible. They attack them. Jung realized he was not treating pathology. He was not sitting across from a broken mind. He was observing what happens when consciousness becomes too differentiated for the social environment to tolerate. He was watching what he described as differentiated perception in its most concentrated form. This is the first thing you need to understand. Differentiated perception is not a gift that society rewards. It is a gift that society fears, and fear, in human beings, almost always transforms into aggression. Now, to understand why this happens, you need to understand what Jung actually meant by participation mystique. The term itself was not original to Jung. He borrowed it from anthropologist Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, who used it to describe a state in which the boundary between self and other becomes permeable. In primitive communities, individuals did not experience themselves as fully separate from the group. Their identity was merged with the collective. Jung's insight was that most modern people never fully leave this state. They remain psychologically fused with whatever group they belong to, without knowing it. They operate within shared unconscious agreements. Groups, families, workplaces, and communities all function partly because certain truths remain unspoken. There is a collective agreement not to acknowledge the dysfunction in the family, not to name the manipulation in the relationship, not to confront the leader whose behavior is slowly poisoning the organization. These agreements are not made consciously. They are not decided in a meeting. They exist at the level of the collective unconscious, the invisible rules that keep groups cohesive, even when that cohesion is built on avoidance. The highly perceptive individual has differentiated out of this state. They have broken free from the shared unconscious cloud, not by choice, but because their psychological makeup will not allow them to remain submerged. They cannot unsee what the collective has agreed not to see. The group is not angry at them for being different. The group is angry at them for no longer being merged, for being the only person in the room who is not inside the agreement. Jung noted this in his clinical work on shadow dynamics. In his collected works, he wrote extensively about how the person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they merely observe. This is not metaphor. It is a predictable, documentable psychological mechanism. When someone's shadow is reflected back to them through another person's honest perception, the unconscious mind is presented with a choice. It can integrate the shadow, meaning it can look at what is being reflected and accept it as a real part of the self. Or it can attack the mirror. Most people attack the mirror. This is the scapegoat phenomenon. And if you have ever been targeted in a group, in a family, in a workplace, for simply being present and honest, if you have ever been made the problem in a room where you were clearly not the problem, you have experienced this mechanism firsthand. What makes the scapegoat mechanism so disorienting is how convincing it is to everyone involved, including the people perpetrating it. They genuinely believe the perceptive person caused the disruption they feel. They are not lying when they say the atmosphere changed when this person arrived. It did change, but not because the perceptive person brought something toxic. It changed because they brought clarity into a space built on its absence. A group organized around a shared illusion will always experience truth as an intrusion. Now let us go deeper, because Jung did not treat all highly perceptive people as the same. He identified distinct expressions within the introverted intuitive type, shaped by which auxiliary function sits alongside the dominant intuition. In psychological types, intuition and sensation are opposites. If intuition is your strongest function, sensation is your weakest. What differs between people is which secondary function, thinking or feeling, they bring to bear on what they perceive. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. The first is the introverted intuitive with a thinking auxiliary. This person processes perception primarily through the analytical mind. They do not just feel that something is wrong. They can map it. They can trace the behavioral pattern backward through time and forward into predictable outcomes. They see the logical conclusion of a dynamic months before it arrives. They can watch a relationship and know, with quiet certainty, that it will collapse in a specific way, for a specific reason. When they try to share this, they are called cold, or calculating, or paranoid. What they are, in reality, is operating at a level of pattern recognition that their environment is not equipped to receive. Jung wrote in his collected works that the introverted intuitive functions through unconscious pattern recognition that feels like direct knowing. This is not a conclusion they reasoned toward. It is a perception that arrived whole, the way a scent arrives before you have named what you are smelling. The thinking auxiliary means they then reverse engineer the logic of what they already perceived. They construct the argument for something they already know is true. And this is often where others dismiss them, because the argument sounds elaborate, even manufactured, when in reality it is simply a translation of an insight that cannot be fully rendered in linear language. The second is the introverted intuitive with a feeling auxiliary. This person absorbs perception through the emotional body. They do not just observe others' pain from a distance. They feel it inside themselves, often before they can identify where it came from. They wake up heavy with someone else's grief. They sit down to a meal and feel a sadness that does not belong to them. Jung wrote of these individuals living in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment. The danger here is not just exhaustion, it is identity erosion. When you cannot tell the difference between your own emotional state and the emotional state you have absorbed from the room, you begin to lose the thread back to yourself. Both types share the same weak point. In Jungian typology, the dominant function and its opposite are always in tension. For the introverted intuitive, the inferior function is sensation. Their greatest gift is paired with their greatest blind spot, which is physical reality, practical details, the body, the here and now. The introverted intuitive often struggles to stay grounded, to manage day-to-day logistics, to feel fully present. Their consciousness is almost always somewhere ahead of or beneath ordinary sensory reality, and this gap is another source of the isolation they carry. The rarest expression Jung identified combines introverted intuition with what he called an undifferentiated auxiliary function. In simple terms, this person receives vast amounts of unconscious information but lacks the internal structure to organize and express it through either consistent thinking or feeling. They know, but they cannot always explain what they know or why they know it. They exist in a state of perpetual overwhelm, flooded with perceptual data they cannot file, sort, or communicate. They are often the most gifted and the most isolated. Understanding which expression describes you is not a parlor game. It is about understanding the specific way your nervous system processes reality, so you can stop trying to function as though you are built like everyone else. Now we arrive at what Jung called the 3 specific dangers of undifferentiated perception. These are not abstract risks. These are the predictable outcomes for the highly perceptive person who has not yet learned to integrate what they see. The first danger is collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote that the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. Think of it this way. Every group, every family, every organization is held together partly by what its members agree not to see. The highly perceptive individual walks into that space, and simply by being present, illuminates what everyone has agreed to keep in the dark. They are not trying to cause chaos. They are not being provocative. They are being authentic. But authenticity in a system built on avoidance is experienced as an attack. The result is that the perceptive person is identified as the threat, even when they are the only person accurately diagnosing the problem. This is not a coincidence. It is the system protecting itself. The second danger is psychological isolation. Jung described this with brutal clarity. The curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation is not just social, it is existential. The highly perceptive person does not just feel misunderstood, they feel as though they are living in a different version of reality from everyone around them. And in a functional sense, they are. They are processing more information, more accurately, at a deeper level. The gap between their experience of a situation and everyone else's experience of the same situation can become so wide that genuine communication feels impossible. Think about what that actually means for a day-to-day life. You sit in a meeting and you can feel the unspoken conflict between two colleagues with such clarity that you are almost distracted by it, but no one mentions it. You sit at a family dinner and you can sense the grief beneath the small talk, the old wound that nobody is allowed to name, the agreement that everyone at the table has made without a word being exchanged. You go on a date with someone charming and likable, and you feel, with quiet certainty, that something important is hidden beneath the warmth. And you cannot explain how you know. You just know. Now try to explain any of that to someone who does not feel it. Try to say, "I can sense there is something wrong here," and have that land as credible rather than paranoid. The perceptive person learns very quickly that naming what they perceive invites ridicule, dismissal, and sometimes outright hostility, so they go quiet. They carry the awareness alone, and the longer they carry it alone, the more isolated they become, not just from others, but from the belief that their own perception is trustworthy. Jung identified this erosion of self-trust as one of the most significant wounds the highly perceptive person can sustain. Because the perception itself never stops. The information keeps arriving, but the person has been trained through repeated social punishment to distrust the instrument that receives it. They override their own accuracy with other people's insistence that nothing is wrong, and the gap between what they genuinely perceive and what they are willing to acknowledge widens until they can no longer find their way back to themselves. The third danger is the most insidious. Jung called it identity dissolution. This is what happens when the highly perceptive person has absorbed so much external psychological material that they can no longer find their own authentic self beneath the accumulated weight. They know what everyone else is feeling. They know what everyone else is hiding, but they have lost the thread back to their own desires, their own needs, their own identity. Under this kind of pressure, the differentiated person can collapse back into participation mystique. Not because they chose it, but because the weight of being the only conscious person in an unconscious system finally became more than they could carry alone. This is why Jung described the integration of superior perception as not merely therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Because the alternative is not staying as you are, the alternative is disappearing. This brings us to a pattern that repeats across Jung's cases. Every single time, without exception, the highly perceptive person enters a group. The group initially values their awareness. They are the one who senses trouble before it arrives. They are the one who can mediate conflict because they see both sides simultaneously. They are trusted. They are useful. But then something shifts. As the group's dynamics become more complex, as its collective shadow grows heavier, the perceptive person begins to reflect back things the group does not want to see. They notice the leader's narcissism. They observe the dysfunction being passed off as loyalty. They sense the lie at the center of the group's shared story. They do not accuse. They may not even say anything, but the group senses that they see. And this is where the targeting begins. Suddenly, the person who was trusted is called difficult. The person who was valued for their perception is now accused of creating drama. Their observations are reframed as attacks. Their accuracy is reframed as arrogance. Their honesty is reframed as disloyalty. The group begins to organize against them with a collective energy that feels overwhelming and irrational because it is irrational. It is being driven by unconscious dynamics, not conscious reasoning. Jung wrote about this in his work on the scapegoat mechanism. The bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. The scapegoat does not carry the group's sins because they are guilty. They carry them because they were the one awake enough to see them. If this sounds familiar, if this describes an experience you have carried alone, that feeling of being punished for simply being perceptive, there is something important you need to hear. You did not misread the situation. What you saw was real. And the force that came against you was not personal. It was psychological. It was a system protecting its unconscious agreements from the one person in the room who could not pretend not to see them. Now we arrive at what we might call the clarity event. Jung described this moment as a confrontation with the unconscious, a point where accumulated pattern recognition can no longer be suppressed by the need to maintain social belonging. In the cases he documented most closely, there is a recurring moment, a threshold. The highly perceptive person has spent months or years absorbing information, sensing the truth, then filing that truth away quietly because the social cost of acknowledging it was too high. They have been called too sensitive, too intense, too negative. They have doubled down on goodwill, on patience, on giving the benefit of the doubt, and then the pattern recognition finally outweighs the need to believe the best in people who have shown them, repeatedly, who they are. This is not a breakdown. Jung was very specific about this. Consider the clinical profiles he recorded of this process. What he observed was not emotional collapse. What he observed was an eerie, unsettling calm. These individuals stopped trying to explain themselves. They stopped trying to correct perceptions or defend their character. They simply withdrew their attention. And in withdrawing their attention, they withdrew the one thing the group had been depending on them to provide, which was the invisible labor of holding the group's disowned emotional content. The group felt it immediately. The energy shifted. The dynamic that had been stable, even if it was a dysfunctional stability, suddenly became unstable. And the people who had been using the perceptive person as a psychological container, a place to deposit all the shadow material they refused to own, found themselves confronted with that shadow returning to its source. Jung called this shadow integration under extreme duress. It is not a conscious process. It is not a strategy. It is what happens when a person has been pushed beyond their capacity to absorb what does not belong to them, and something inside them stops accepting the charge. The clarity event is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different one. Here is where Jung's framework becomes not just descriptive but prescriptive, because he did not document these patterns only to explain suffering. He documented them to map the path out of it. He called this path the individuation process. For the highly perceptive person, individuation is not a philosophical exercise. It is a survival strategy. The first phase is recognition and differentiation. This is the practice of learning to identify which psychological material belongs to you and which you have absorbed from your environment. Jung instructed his patients to create deliberate time in complete solitude, not for rest, but for clarity. When you have spent years functioning as a psychological sponge, absorbing the unconscious contents of every room you walk into, you can lose the ability to distinguish your authentic emotional state from the residue of everyone else's. Solitude is the practice of letting that residue settle so you can see the water underneath it. This is not introversion for its own sake. It is a psychic hygiene practice. Without it, the highly perceptive person becomes a vessel for collective shadow material they cannot metabolize because it was never theirs. The second phase is shadow integration. Here is where Jung challenges the highly perceptive person in a way that requires real honesty. Because the people who see others' shadows most clearly are often the ones who have the least awareness of their own. Jung wrote, Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward. The perceptive person can see the manipulation in others with devastating accuracy. But can they see the moments when they themselves have been manipulative? They can sense the arrogance in a room. But do they have access to the moments when their own certainty tipped into superiority? Shadow integration is not about dismantling your gifts or doubting your perception. It is about owning the full human being beneath those gifts. Because the only person who can see clearly without distortion is the person who has been honest about the distortions in their own lens. The third phase is what Jung called conscious participation. This is the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed by them or losing your individual identity in them. Jung used the term psychological containers to describe the internal capacity to hold something without becoming it, to observe someone's grief without drowning in it, to perceive someone's manipulation without being swept into the drama of it, to see the shadow in a group without taking responsibility for integrating it on behalf of people who have not asked for your help. This is the difference between an unconscious empath and what Jung called an individuated perceptive person. The unconscious empath absorbs, the individuated person witnesses. Jung spent years studying what distinguished people who integrated their superior perception from those who were destroyed by it. Two historical figures appeared frequently in his reflections. The first was Friedrich Nietzsche. Jung had deep respect for Nietzsche's philosophical vision and deep concern about his psychological trajectory. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote about Nietzsche's extraordinary ability to see through the social, religious, and philosophical facades of his time. Nietzsche possessed a form of differentiated perception that was genuinely rare. He could see what his culture had agreed not to see, and he named it with a precision that was, and remains, uncomfortable. But Nietzsche never integrated his shadow. His certainty about the falsehood of others' worldviews was not matched by equal honesty about the falsehood in his own. He wielded his perception as a weapon, rather than as a service. He withdrew from relationship, rather than learning to hold it consciously. And he became consumed by what he saw, rather than transformed by it. Jung's assessment was not cruel. It was clinical. He wrote that Nietzsche remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. The result was inflation that ultimately collapsed into breakdown. The second figure was Meister Eckhart, the 14th century German mystic. Jung found in Eckhart an example of what successfully integrated superior perception looked like. Eckhart possessed what Jung described as mystical intuition, a capacity to perceive spiritual and psychological realities genuinely beyond the consensus reality of his time. But unlike Nietzsche, Eckhart channeled that perception into compassionate service. He offered his insights as invitations, not attacks on those who could not see what he saw. He spoke in ways that created understanding rather than resistance. And he held his gifts with what Jung called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is not a personal achievement, but a responsibility. The difference between Nietzsche and Eckhart is not intelligence or depth of perception. It is whether perception was integrated into a whole person or weaponized by a fractured one. So what does integration look like in practical terms? How does the journey from overwhelmed perception to what we might call warrior consciousness, the individuated state Jung described as engaged, boundaried, and strategically present, actually unfold? Jung outlined the stages of individuation as a framework for exactly this process. The first movement is the shift from absorption to observation. The overwhelmed perceptive person lives inside the psychological weather of every room they enter. The integrating person learns to stand slightly outside that weather while still being present within it. This is not emotional numbness. It is not detachment. It is the development of what Jung called the observing ego, the part of the self that can witness experience without being consumed by it. The second movement is the shift from compulsive honesty to selective truth-telling. The highly perceptive person often carries a compulsion to name what they see. Part of this comes from integrity. Part of it comes from the exhausting weight of holding unspoken truth. But Jung observed that indiscriminate truth-telling is not wisdom. It is the unintegrated expression of perception without discernment. The integrated perceptive person learns to ask, not just whether something is true, but whether this person, in this moment, has the capacity to receive this truth. Perception without discretion is not a gift. It is a disruption. The third movement is the shift from isolation to selective connection. Jung was direct about this. Individuation cannot happen in a vacuum. It requires what he called witnessing by those capable of recognizing authenticity. The perceptive person, burned by years of being targeted for what they see, will often swing to the opposite extreme and withdraw entirely. This is understandable. It is also a trap. There is a version of withdrawal that looks like wisdom. The perceptive person has learned correctly that sharing their awareness with people who are not ready leads to attack. They have learned correctly that they cannot pour themselves out endlessly for systems that drain them and then blame them for running dry. So they pull back. They build their life smaller, quieter, more controlled. But Jung observed that this strategy, carried too far, produces its own kind of damage. The individuated person does not withdraw from the world, he wrote. They engage with it more consciously. The goal is not to find a life where your perception never has to encounter unconscious people. That life does not exist. The goal is to develop the inner architecture that allows you to move through unconscious spaces without losing yourself in them. To engage fully without absorbing everything. To be present without being consumed. This requires learning the difference between people who are unavailable for consciousness and people who are simply not yet there. Jung believed in a kind of developmental patience, not the passive, martyred patience of someone who keeps giving to people who take without reciprocating, but the active, discerning patience of someone who can assess accurately where another person is and what they are genuinely capable of receiving. Jung described 3 essential types of relationships for the highly perceptive individual. Fellow individuated persons, those who have done enough inner work to engage with another conscious person without defensiveness. People actively engaged in their own individuation, who may not share the same depth of perception, but who are honest about their own shadows. And what Jung called natural containers, mature people who have been through enough difficulty to hold other people's truth without being shattered by it. The practice is not to find people who agree with everything you perceive. The practice is to find people who can engage with your perceptions as valuable contributions, rather than threats to their own carefully maintained self-image. There is a particular pitfall Jung documented with precision because he had watched so many highly perceptive people fall into it. Jung called it psychic inflation. It is what happens when the ego becomes identified with a power far greater than itself and begins to mistake that identification for genuine development. In everyday terms, it produces what we might call the prophet complex. After this confrontation with the unconscious, after integration begins, the perceptive person has access to a new kind of confidence. They have stopped doubting their perceptions. They have stopped apologizing for seeing what they see. This is necessary and healthy, but there is a razor's edge between confidence and psychic inflation, that state where the ego becomes identified with a power exceeding its capacity to hold. The prophet complex looks like this. The perceptive person begins to experience their accuracy, not as a function of a well-developed psychological faculty, but as evidence of a special mission. They become convinced it is their responsibility to wake up everyone around them. They begin to judge people who are not yet conscious with the same impatience they once experienced from people who could not tolerate their own consciousness. They preach rather than witness. They correct rather than model. They become, in the very way they feared being treated, intolerant of others' limitations. Jung wrote about this with characteristic directness. The moment one believes oneself to be the bearer of absolute truth, one has fallen into the trap of unconscious possession by the very forces one seeks to understand. The protection against the prophet complex is not to doubt your perception. It is to remember that your perception is not the same as your judgment, and your judgment is not the same as the truth. You can see what someone is doing and still have no idea what that person's full story is, what wounds they are carrying, what progress they have already made in ways invisible to you. Perception is data. Wisdom is knowing what to do with data, and wisdom requires humility. Here is the final movement in Jung's map, the highest expression of what the perceptive person is capable of becoming. He called it the transcendent function. After that confrontation with the unconscious, after the integration work, after the development of what we might call warrior consciousness, selective presence, and conscious participation in relationships, the individuated perceptive person arrives at a place where their gifts are no longer a burden they carry, and no longer a weapon they wield, and no longer an identity they perform. They become a bridge. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self that the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about change in society. He believed that people who successfully integrate superior perception serve a genuinely evolutionary function. They see what the collective is not yet ready to see. They hold that awareness with patience, without forcing it, without preaching it, but without suppressing it either. They embody more conscious ways of being and allow that embodiment to do its work simply through presence. This is what distinguishes the integrated perceptive person from both the unconscious absorber and the inflated prophet. They do not dim their light to make unconscious people comfortable, but they also do not wield their light as a weapon against people who are still in the dark. They simply carry it, and they trust that light does what light does. Jung observed that at the highest level of integration, the perceptive person holds their abilities lightly. There is no performance of consciousness. There is simply a quality of presence that people respond to, often without being able to name why. The manipulative person feels exposed without being confronted. The grieving person feels held without being smothered. The person living inside a lie feels, for the first time, the uneasy proximity of the truth they have been avoiding. This is not a power that needs to be managed. It is a quality that emerges naturally from integration. The individuated perceptive person does not try to be this way. They become it, and they stop needing the world to acknowledge what they are, because their relationship to their own perception has become so steady, so rooted, that external validation simply ceases to be the point. Jung returned, in his final reflections on these cases, to a principle he considered foundational. The goal is not to see less. The goal is to see more wisely. Not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what is perceived. Consider a composite profile modeled on the transformation Jung documented across multiple cases during this period. A woman who could not maintain a job, could not hold a friendship, could not function in the ordinary social world because she absorbed too much of the psychological reality of everyone around her. She came to him broken. She came to him certain that what she carried was a curse. After years of working with Jung's individuation framework, her life transformed completely. She learned to distinguish her own psychological contents from what she absorbed from others. She found work as a counselor, a context where her differentiated perception was not a disruption, but a profound service. She built relationships with people who valued what she saw rather than fearing it, and she stopped experiencing her perception as something that was happening to her and began relating to it as something she could consciously choose when and how to engage. Jung's observation of her transformation is worth sitting with. She learned not to see less, but to see more wisely, not to perceive less deeply, but to engage more consciously with what she perceived. Her gift remained intact. Her relationship to it became integrated rather than overwhelming. That transformation is available to anyone with the perceptive capacity Jung described, who is willing to do the uncomfortable, unglamorous, necessary work of individuation. And that work does not begin with mastering a technique or adopting a framework. It begins with one act of radical honesty. You stop explaining yourself to people who have chosen not to understand you. You stop trying to fix systems that are designed to use your awareness for their benefit without protecting your well-being in return. You stop mistaking the absence of validation for the absence of truth. What you see is real. What you have sensed, the lies, the patterns, the dynamics that no one else was willing to name. Those perceptions were not dramatic or paranoid or created by your sensitivity. They were accurate readings of a psychological reality that the collective was invested in keeping invisible. There is a cost to that, accuracy. Jung never pretended otherwise. The cost is that you do not get to choose what you notice. You cannot unsee what you have seen. Once perception is this differentiated, there is no going backward into comfortable unawareness. The path is always forward. But forward is not the same as alone, and perceptive is not the same as burdened. Jung's entire body of work on this question points toward one conclusion. The capacity to see clearly is only a curse as long as you are trying to use it in a context that punishes you for it. When that capacity is integrated, when it is held within a whole and honest self, when it is directed with wisdom rather than compulsion, it becomes exactly what the world most needs from you and what you most need from yourself. The world does not need more perceptive people who have been talked out of trusting their own perception. The world does not need more conscious individuals who have been broken down into agreeable, manageable versions of themselves by people who could not tolerate what they reflected back. The world needs awakened, perceptive people who trust their observations absolutely, who have integrated their shadow so they can see without distortion, who have developed the discernment to know when to speak and when to hold their wisdom with patience, and who have stopped waiting for permission from unconscious systems to be exactly who they are. That is what Jung called the integrated empath, not someone who has grown a thicker skin, not someone who has learned to see less or care less or feel less. Someone who has gone through the fire of isolation, targeting, and that confrontation with the unconscious, and emerged not hardened, but whole. The bridge between what the world is and what it is becoming does not need to be built by someone who has forgotten what it means to perceive deeply. It needs to be built by someone who never stopped. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.